Welcome, everyone. I'm joined by none other than American sociologist Professor Salvatore Babones, who's become quite well known in India for busting the myths and narratives around global ranking indexes and more. I'm Shivani Gupta. Salvatore, thanks a lot for speaking to CNN News 18 one more time. And I want to begin by asking you particularly about former President Barack Obama's comments because they've made a lot of headlines in India, coming as they were, even as the Prime Minister was about to, speak in the White House after his bilateral with current President Joe Biden and getting into that press conference. I want to understand from you, was Barack Obama elucidating his personal view, a view of the Democrats, or a view of the American establishment?
This would have been very much a personal view. And I have to remind people that Barack Obama and Joe Biden are not great friends. It was well known that Barack Obama resented having Joe Biden inserted as his vice president, thought that Joe Biden had been sent to babysit him in some sense, and yet he felt exactly the opposite, that he was always babysitting Joe Biden. So this certainly wouldn't have been done in consultation with Joe Biden. That said, Barack Obama's views, I think, simply reflect the establishment view in the United States. If you listen carefully to what Jake Sullivan, the U.S. National Security Advisor, said, if you look carefully even at what the president said, neither of them, or for that matter, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Representative McCarthy, none of them stood up and said, we're very proud to be working with India because of its excellent human rights record. Instead, all of them towed the line that, well, India's human rights problems should be solved internally within India. They should be addressed through quiet diplomacy, not through overt name calling. But they never actually defended India. And I think that's something that may have been missed by a lot of Indians watching all the wonderful compliments India was paid last week. I think they may have missed that those compliments were very generic, and there was a real unwillingness among American leaders to stand up for India.
Interesting you say that because there was a difference in the tone and tenor and the thrust of the current president's comments when he was asked the same question and the
Of
former
course.
president. The former president clubbed India and China, while the current president said that India and US share the same DNA and the same values and neither is perfect. So he clubbed India and US and not India and China. Do you see that as a dissonance between these two leaders in America, or is there a dissonance that goes deeper?
Look, the difference isn't in what the leaders think. The difference is in who's in office and who's out of office, and thus who has to speak diplomatically and who can speak freely. Now, that lumping of India and China in the same category, that's not coming from Barack Obama's deep knowledge of India. That's coming directly from the Rise of Democracy Institute's latest report. Now, VDEM is highly respected, the Rise of Democracy Institute based in Gothenburg, Sweden, at the University of Gothenburg. They, in their latest report, highlighted the equivalence between India having what they called an electoral autocracy and China having a closed autocracy. But they actually wrote the entire report around the structure of the equivalence of India and China, one having elections, one not having elections, but both being autocracies. Now, that narrative is ridiculous to anyone who's very familiar with India. But that narrative goes deep in the broad Western consciousness of what India is like today. Barack Obama wasn't doing his own research on it. He didn't give me a call and say, Professor Babones, what does your latest work say on India? He was simply repeating back what was in his intelligence briefings. Remember, he's still getting intelligence briefings, and his intelligence briefing could have told him, this is what VDEM says. This is what Reporters Sans Frontières says. This is what Human Rights Watch says. This is what the United States Holocaust Museum says, which is the most respected institution in the United States on human rights. Well, they're the ones saying that India faces a potential Muslim genocide in the 2020s. Now, those views are wildly off base. They're wildly out of step with the reality of India. But nonetheless, those views are the bedrock views of the American establishment today. They're taken for granted in the American establishment today. The question isn't, should we or should we not admire India's human rights record? The question is, should we or should we not condemn India's human rights record. And I'm sorry to go on at length, but the one op-ed I was able to place about this in the U.S. press during Mr. Modi's visit was titled by the newspaper that published it, "Should we condemn Modi's India?" Now, I didn't submit it under that title. That was how they saw it. The question for them was, should we or should we not be publicly condemning India? The question was not, does India have a problem? They took it for granted that India had a problem.
So, as you very rightly outlined, that India has a problem, at least in terms of perception in the American
Absolutely.
establishment and all the rankings. So, my next question to you is, since you believe that actually these rankings are false or they are hyperbole about the situation in India, certainly it's nobody's contention that India is perfect. And that was repeated ad nauseum during the Prime Minister's visit to the US as well. What does India need to do to be seen differently or honestly by these rankings?
We need more and better information about India to get out into the public sphere. Now, look, I'm doing my bit out. Everyone knows I've started a think tank called the Indian Century Roundtable. We're trying to get it funded to try to present a view of India in the West, an accurate view of India in the West. But the real problem is a lack of information. For example, if I were to say that more Muslims have been killed in mass attacks in New Zealand in the last 5 years than in India, people would think I'm crazy. They would say, no, we know New Zealand. It's a wonderful place. But in fact, more Muslims have been killed in mass attacks in New Zealand. The 2019 terrorist attack in Christchurch killed more Muslims than have been killed in any large-scale violence in India over the last 5 years. Now, we don't condemn New Zealand because everybody already knows a lot about New Zealand, already has a very positive perception of New Zealand. And so when that happens in New Zealand, it's perceived as some kind of bizarre exception. Now, I guarantee you that were 200 Muslims killed in a terrorist attack in India this year, that would color perceptions of India for the rest of the decade, because people don't have an alternative source of knowledge about India. They don't already have a well-developed sense that India is a liberal democracy that stands for human rights for its own citizens as well as in the rest of the world. Now, I have to say, India does not work very hard to get out that message. India's own Ministry of External Affairs is very defensive about this. It says it's not for you to judge India, instead of saying, thank you for judging India, but your judgment is wrong. Here are the facts. And I think India really could start reversing this narrative simply by presenting facts instead of by presenting a defensive, none of your business.
Is this also a little bit of a first world bias towards a quote unquote third world country like India?
It very much is, because there's an assumption that we know about the third world, and that's an unfortunate term, but it is an apt term. I mean, India is very much part of the third world in the sense that it did not join either the American or the Soviet bloc during the Cold War, and it was part of that third world. It was the leader of that third world. So India, of all countries, is a quote-unquote third world country. But we've come to associate third world with poverty and backwardness. Now, there's still a lot of poverty in India, and if people get upset when I say that India is a poor country, look, I'm sorry, it has a GDP per capita of $2,300 a year. That's poor by global standards. But India, unlike virtually every other poor country, is a vibrant democracy that protects human rights, that has rule of law. It's very difficult to find a country with a GDP per capita under about $8,000 per capita that has anything resembling Western style of rule of law. Yet India's rule of law doesn't just resemble Western style of rule of law. It's very similar. I mean, it's almost exactly the same as Western style rule of law. So India is very much an exception. Now, when Americans just assume, and forgive me, I'm going to speak here in a way that I wouldn't speak, but how Americans speak is, well, India and Pakistan, they're both always just fighting. None of them can see sense. That is, Americans don't want to take the time to think through what are the actual events that have occurred between these countries. Who has attacked whom? What can India do if there is Pakistani terrorism infiltrating into Kashmir, into Jammu, even for that matter, into Punjab? Of course, India has to fight this kind of international terrorism. Yet in America, instead of seeing that as India is plagued by international terrorism, they see it as, India and Pakistan are always fighting. Why can't they get along? Now, how you get those facts out is a difficult question, but it has to start with the MFA, if India of MEA, if India is not going to get those facts out, who else is going to?
Well, possibly that will change as India earns a bigger global voice. My another question to you is another contention is that this heightened scrutiny and criticism of India is also because who is the current prime minister?
Yeah.
That since 2014, because Narendra Modi is seen as a quote Hindu nationalist leader, the attacks have sharpened against India. They were softer earlier. Would you say that that is correct? That the issue is very much who is the prime minister today?
That's certainly true to some extent, in that Mr. Modi fits the Western image, and I stress that the Western image of a third world dictator. He mainly speaks in his national language, not in English. He has a beard. He's brown. I mean, dare I say it? For all of our talk of anti-racism in the United States, we remain a racist country in our initial responses to things. He does not fit the bill. When Rahul Gandhi goes and speaks abroad, he seems very suave, very Western. He speaks English fluently. He's a much more sympathetic figure to Western audiences than is Mr. Modi. Now, that said, Mr. Modi convinced a lot of people with his speech at the Congress. This was televised in the United States, and my own relatives, some of them called me and said, "Wow, I was really impressed with what he said." So, it's not necessary. If Mr. Modi is put in front of people in the West, I think he can convince people. But the initial reaction is simply that, well, he doesn't speak English. He's openly Hindu. He doesn't wear a suit. Instead, he wears traditional Indian clothing. There must be something wrong with him. And I think we can see this in a concrete way. The United States Pew Research Center's International Religious Freedom Rankings has rated India in the bottom 5 countries in the world ever since 2008. But we never heard about it in 2008. We never heard about it until after 2014. And the reason we didn't hear about it until then is it wasn't being weaponized until then. Unfortunately, today it's being weaponized.
I actually didn't mean it so much about how Americans look at India or Indians. I meant that since Narendra Modi came to power, groups that are anti BJP or anti Narendra Modi, they've sharpened their attacks. And as you said, they're being heard more, and the attacks have been weaponized, or these rankings have been weaponized against India, because a lot of people in India feel, and certainly Narendra Modi's party feels, that this is primarily the group of people opposed to them coming together and harping on India to ensure that he doesn't have legitimacy or does not come back to power.
Well, this comes back to my notorious statement that, quote unquote, India's intellectuals are anti India. Now, I want to be clear. I don't in any way mean to imply that all Indian intellectuals are anti India. The point of that was to say that our Western perceptions of India, the anti-India perceptions that we are getting primarily from India's own intellectual class. That is, people who are able to speak in the West. If you look at who's writing for the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the New York Times about India, almost all of the major columnists who are writing about India for those three pivotal newspapers are of Indian origin, and they're the ones who are telling us that India has these serious human rights problems. It is very much a narrative coming out of India. Now, we might have seen something similar when Congress was in power, except the BJP the BJP is not full of intellectuals who have strong Western connections. So when Congress is in power, yeah, there might be a lot of complaints about Congress in India, because anti-Congress intellectuals are ruthlessly attacking Congress. That's the nature of politics. The difference is that with the BJP in power, Congress-aligned intellectuals, communist intellectuals, are attacking India, not attacking the government, not only in the Indian press, but also in the Western press, because they have access to the Western press. So certainly a lot of this narrative originates in India, but I really want to stress it's up to the Indian government, and from a political party standpoint, it's up to the BJP to be presenting its narrative, and it has not been doing so effectively. The response of both the Indian government at an official level and the BJP at a party level has been to say it's none of your business what we do in India, instead of saying actually our record is quite strong. Please come look at it.
All right. Salvatore Babones, always a pleasure to talk to you and listen to your views because they combine uniquely a Western perspective but also an understanding of India, which is unique and rare. I do thank you for your time one more time.
Thank you.